Please put your hands together for Bill and Melinda Gates. Please give a warm welcome to their excellencies, the President of the Government of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, and the First Lady, Maria Begoña Gomez. And now, our host for the day, Tamelo Mototwani.
Woo! Are you ready for today? Oh man, I'm so excited. Good morning and welcome to this third annual Goalkeepers event held right here in New York. And please, let's give it just one more time for OG Ethiopia. Wasn't she amazing? Oh, I was out there backstage just singing, "We're out there, do you see me?" Oh, she's absolutely amazing. Now, she's fresh just out of college and using her talent and voice to change the world. But we are all here to make progress happen, of course, around the 17 crucial global goals through collaboration, through innovation, and through action. So, if you came in expecting a half hour on avant-garde jazz, you might just be in for a shock, girlfriend. It ain't happening this morning. But in the last 12 months, there have been goalkeeper gatherings held in Berlin, some were held in Johannesburg, which I was lucky enough to host. And this thing, trust me, it is growing. And take it from me once more, once you got the bug, you just can't keep away. But first things first, let's show you exactly what we've got coming up during this supercharged day. We have no less than 2 prime ministers on this stage this very morning. We have Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. Let's give her a round of applause. Yeah. We also have Spain's Pedro Sanchez. A round of applause for him. And then Bill Gates will take a look at the Goalkeepers report and explore how we can change the odds. Melinda Gates then will follow and take on the reframing of bias and breaking barriers to equality. And then what we all came for, the coffee break, right? Here for some New York coffee, honey. But after that, we host Goalkeepers First, which is a live recording of the BBC World Debate, which is hosted by Zainab Badawi. Looking forward to that? Yeah? Yeah, we're going to make some celebrities out here. We didn't, forget you. But before we launch into the final session, Goalkeepers Unite, where we'll be turning the focus on what we can all of course, do together, which is next year. And we'll be closing with a grand musical finale, which is exciting. And that, my friends, is your morning. Now, against the backdrop of progress and action for the goals, what is becoming clear is that while breakthroughs on health and development just keep on coming, progress isn't accelerating at the rate it needs to in the places that it needs the most. And while the reasons for that are as complex as you'd imagine, there's one overwhelming factor, and that is inequality. We spoke about that last night. And take it from me, as someone who comes from what is officially termed the most unequal country in the world, which is South Africa, that is something we need to address with a sense of urgency. Now, may the rest and the recent outcry about sexual violence in South Africa be a lesson and the beginning of a new era of equality, of love, and unity in my home country and beyond. Yeah. Well, Goalkeepers is powered by its community, and in the room right now are the vital advisory board members, which is a group of remarkable women and men who offer strategic input into our mission of advancing the goals and the work to expand the reach and network of goalkeepers in their own countries and regions. So if they're here today, please give us a wave. We need to give you a shout out. Can we see you, please, advisory board? We just want to wave at you. Hi, welcome. Well, they will be around at lunch and at this afternoon's workshop, and they want to talk to you. So please seek them out and have conversations, right? But Goalkeepers is also powered by creativity. And just as in the past, we've had stellar poets and performers this year, we have 3 incredible artists in residence. The stunning Sherry Silver and her dancers who opened the show last night. Did you enjoy that? That was amazing. We also saw the awesome Ogie Theodora who kicked us off today. And we also have our live illustrator, Lorraine Borglio. A round of applause for her as well, who's sitting right here. And we'll be capturing the energy and sound bites in the room, so prepare to be immortalized people. It's about to be amazing. And finally, my last message. If over the course of the day you find yourself asking what it takes to be a goalkeeper, it's leadership, it's innovation, it's action to achieve the global goals. It is you. And thank you so much for being here today. We hope the day, of course, is both useful and fun. We want to hear as much from you as possible, so please spread the word and don't forget to hashtag Goalkeepers19. So all the goalkeepers around the world can be a part of this amazing initiative, popping up, of course, in your feed after feed. So we're in the best room in New York City right now, best view, best people, and to prove it, we're about to be joined by someone who not only co-created Goalkeepers, but who by her actions inspires millions, including myself, to think more, to say more, and to do more. Goalkeepers, please give a warm round of applause and welcome to Melinda Gates.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. The world knows who Prime Minister Ardern is. Not only is she an amazing person as a world leader, she's teaching us how to govern with empathy and with strength. She's a champion for people who too often have the odds stacked against them. Prime Minister Ardern is a champion of women. She's the second elected leader ever to give birth while in office. And she's the first ever to take maternity leave while in office. She's taken that experience and used it to advocate for expanding the rights of women in New Zealand. She's released an international human rights plan in which New Zealand promises to take the lead on, among other things, gender equality and women and girls empowerment. The Prime Minister is a champion for inclusion and for belonging. She's worked with New Zealand's Indigenous Maori people toward better jobs and better wages, and she's striving to move the Maori language to the heart of New Zealand's day-to-day conversations. She articulates, as few others do, the importance of the climate crisis for the future, and she's challenged inaction that she sees by the large states in the Pacific region. She's pledged to have child poverty in the next decade, and after the horrific massacre at Christchurch earlier this year, she guided her nation through its dark hour, and us as a world at showing what leadership looks like with moral clarity. She's done all of this after only being in office for 2 years, so I'm excited to welcome here a true international leader who understands the future of the world depends on eliminating inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and thank you so much for the warmth of your welcome today. If it's not entirely obvious to all of you, I was born in the 1980s, the decade of big hair, big shoulders, and very big reforms. A decade where New Zealand went through a period of rapid privatisation and rapid economic liberalisation. While many have argued that aspects of these reforms were needed to open our economy to the world, the pace of change undeniably came with a high price. Jobs were lost, manufacturing moved offshore, regulations were removed, and the gap between rich and poor quickly expanded. Then came the 1990s, and New Zealand introduced further reforms that brought user pay to the fore and welfare cuts for the most vulnerable. Now, I was young when all of this was still happening, but I do still remember it. I was the daughter of a policeman in a town of just 3,000 people, and I only had to look around me to see people being left behind. Now, if it's possible to begin building your social conscience when you are just a small child, then that is what happened to me. Now, I never viewed the world through the lens of politics, not then, and in many ways, I still don't now. Instead, I try to view it through the lens of children and people, and through the most basic concept and idea of fairness. When I eventually signed up to a political party when I was 17 years old, I wasn't particularly looking for a career. I wanted, perhaps naively, to change the world. I was promptly handed 300 leaflets and told to start changing the world one letterbox at a time. The world has changed immeasurably since then, though. We are both more connected, and yet we are more partisan and more tribal than ever. Inequality has progressed almost as rapidly as development. Now, but thankfully, there are some values that endure. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have always tried to look out for each other and tried to do right by one another. Our track record of striving for equality and our values of compassion and fairness are often sources of national pride, but that hasn't always translated into the progress and the gains that we need. But you know, when it comes to a set of rules for a country to live by, you would struggle to do better than the SDGs. Now, any serious politician would be hard-pressed to argue with goals like halving poverty or providing decent work or quality education and clean water and peace and justice for all. And yet here we are, still struggling. Now, perhaps it's time to acknowledge that it's not the aspiration that is the problem, but the domestic political environments in which we are trying to embed them. Now, let me try and explain what I mean by that. As in many countries, our success in New Zealand has traditionally been measured in purely economic terms. And on these terms, New Zealand has been relatively successful, with rates of growth that international commentators have remarked upon and widely commended. However, the deficiency of such measures has become really clear. The reforms of the 80s and 90s that I referenced just before, they have left an enduring mark on our society. While many people in New Zealand enjoy an enviable quality of life, our social statistics, they tell another story for too many. Unacceptable rates of child poverty, a growing homelessness problem, heartbreaking rates of suicide, and distressingly high family violence. Now, these problems, they are an affront to our national values, and yet they are lived experience for far too many people in our country. Economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is not success. It is failure. And turning things around requires changing both the way we think and the way we act and the way we measure success. So to tackle these issues in New Zealand, the government I'm proud to lead is doing something not many other countries have tried. We've incorporated the principles of the 2030 Agenda into our domestic policy making in a way that we hope will drive system-level actions. This is not just a new scorecard. It is about fundamentally changing how we make decisions and therefore how we allocate resources. For instance, when deciding where to spend public money and manage our national assets, we've decided it's no longer enough to ask what will drive economic growth. Now the question that we as politicians are asking is, what will do the most to improve both the lives of New Zealanders now, but also in the future? Now, to help us answer that question, in New Zealand, we've been having our Treasury developing what's called a living standards framework that measures well-being, it measures risk, it measures resilience across economic, social, and environmental domains. It puts sustainable intergenerational well-being at the heart of our decision-making, not just economic growth. Now, this year, we delivered our first well-being budget in May. Oh, thank you. I didn't expect you to notice. It took an evidence-based approach, and it focused investments in areas like child poverty reduction, helping homeless people off the streets into supported living, sexual and family violence services, and delivering on the aspirations of Māori, our Indigenous people. The centrepiece of the wellbeing budget was the largest ever investment in mental health services New Zealand has ever seen. And this has included the development of a new frontline service where people can get support for mental health needs at their doctor in the same way that they would for a physical ailment. Now, we're investing in mental health because ignoring it is a stain on our society and a drain on our economy. Now, our investment will help people ultimately, we believe, live more fulfilling lives. And a byproduct of that, of course, is that it will increase productivity. That is what real, genuine well-being looks like. It's a values-driven approach to economic success. But it's not just through new policies and programs where we can embed these principles of well-being. For instance, trade is fundamental to New Zealand's economic prosperity. We are a small trading nation, always have been. Well, we are bringing inclusive and sustainability principles to our trade agenda, including by pursuing environmental outcomes in our trade agreements, such as an end to subsidies that encourage illegal fishing. And we strongly advocate for respecting and advancing global rules in the WTO to ensure trade is conducted fairly, rather than on the basis of power, which risks leaving behind both small and developing countries alike. Now, globally, there has been some impressive progress in some SDG areas, such as reductions in extreme poverty and infant mortality, along with respectable progress in discrete areas, such as increased access to electricity. Now, I know we all applaud these advances and the effort taken to achieve them, but in many areas, progress has stalled. Despite global economic growth, the distribution of benefits remains uneven. There has been little change in income inequality, and in some areas, we are going backwards with rising global hunger, rising global greenhouse gas emissions, alarming pressure on natural resources and in the environment. I believe that the change in approach that we have tried and worked hard to adopt in New Zealand, we should perhaps try and work hard to adopt globally. It's about acceleration, but it's also about transformation, how to improve people's well-being and achieve a productive economy at the same time in a way that enhances rather than diminishes our environment and leaves no one behind. Now, internationally, we've had to strengthen the enablers of sustainable development, and we take a values-driven approach. This means prioritizing things like human rights, effective governance and democracy, gender equality, women's empowerment, and the sound stewardship of the environment. We also look for practical ways to get closer to our shared goals, and I want to give you an example. And that is our work alongside others to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and other environmentally harmful subsidies is just one more example. There is no point in subsidizing the climate change that we seek to avert. But ultimately, we need more collaboration, more examples of the international community prioritizing our collective global well-being over domestic self-interest. Now, we will never pretend in New Zealand that we have all the answers, and there is no guarantee that our approach will succeed. But I absolutely believe that new thinking is required. We are lucky in that we have resources enough to support people in need, but we have also the pragmatism and empathy that is required too. And I hope that we can share what we are doing whilst at the same time learning from others. So perhaps the urge to change the world that led me to sign up and drop leaflets in 300 mailboxes some 20 years ago wasn't so naive after all. There is strength in collective action and shared responsibility. We just need more of it. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
And now I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome to the stage another incredible world leader. Also young, also committed to the battle against inequality in his own country. Prime Minister Sanchez has said that the world's response to the global goals must be one that, quote, puts people first, irrespective of their origin or their status, respects our planet and the rights of future generations, builds peace and justice for all of us, and belongs to all of us. Prime Minister Sanchez has made great strides towards turning this vision into reality, both at home and abroad. Please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister of Spain, Mr. Pedro Sanchez. Thank you so much.
Buenos días, Nueva York. Good morning, New York. Thank you very much. Gracias a todos y a todas. It is a true honor to be here with you today. Really it is. Thank you very much indeed for your generous invitation. We are certainly facing huge challenges nowadays. The climate emergency, the increasing inequality and inequity, the deep transformation of our societies due to the digital revolution, just to name a few. Allow me to give you a hint of what is at stake. This year, on the 29th of July, we reached the Earth Overshot Day, which means that from July 30th, we started to consume more resources than the planet can regenerate in a year. At this rate, we will need 1.75 planets annually to maintain our current lifestyle. It is simply unsustainable. There's no planet B. There are two ways of confronting this new reality. One of them is by denying it, thinking that you as a country or as a community live somehow isolated in this interconnected world, being sure that you don't need anything but your own strength and power, closing yourself off to unavoidable change. The other one is by becoming really aware of it, with audacity, leadership, and determination, being bold and taking full commitment for action, believing that the future is in our hands, deeply understanding that what you do or do not do will have consequences. My dear friends, I definitely choose the second reaction. I want to join those who believe that together we can address the huge challenges of our time. I firmly believe that multilateralism, dialogue, and understanding are the only tools we have to tackle these difficult and complex issues. The 2030 Agenda is, to put it simply, our plan. It is the result of an incredible collective effort to deeply transform our societies and adapt them to the future we want, an inclusive and sustainable future for all, leaving no one behind. Leaving no one behind. This is crucial. In the 10 years ahead of us, there are no more excuses. We know that we know what we have to do. We have the framework, the roadmap, and the will to turn the 2030 Agenda into the new global social contract. We have to make sure that this extraordinary spirit becomes a great global alliance. In Spain, In my country, España, we're fully committed to the 2030 agenda. We're fully committed with the 2030 agenda at all levels. At national level, regional level, local authorities, civil society, academia, young and not young so people. Everyone is making it their own agenda, their own plan for generations to come. We are determined to make the 2030 agenda our ethical contract with all citizens and our contribution to our global world. We have placed the 2030 agenda at the very center of our policies. It does have influence on every action, on every initiative we undertake. All SDGs are important, are crucial. They're all interlinked, interconnect. This is one of the great things about the 2030 agenda, in my view. But allow me to take this opportunity to elaborate a little bit further on the importance of SDGs 3 and 4, related to health and education, especially being here with you today. In my view, investing in these two goals will have a spillover effect on many other goals, such as eradicating poverty or reducing inequalities and inequity. It will also lay the foundation for a person to realize their full potential and thrive in life. If you are not healthy, if you don't have access to education, your life will be hindered. I see these goals as the best social equalizers, the tool to put an end to social determinism. This is why it gives me a great pleasure to announce that my country, Spain, will return to the donor community. Gracias. Gracias. We're ready to contribute 100 million euros to the joint fund for the 2030 agenda in the next 5 years, and 100 million euros to the global fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. My dear friends, I would like to conclude by publicly commending the great and admirable effort of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is working so hard and so well to make progress on many of these issues. You are an example of leadership, generosity, solidarity, and great and very serious work. Congratulations. We share your foundation's motto. We are impatient optimists working to reduce inequity in our world. I defend a humanistic agenda that puts people at the center of all action. On a planet with limited resources, we need our planet to endure. I stand for equal opportunities for all, regardless of where they live, their sexual orientation or gender identity, their race, their economic status, and most importantly, equal opportunities for men and women. I defend the freedom of each and every person to face the challenges of the future, and with the guarantee of being able to advance their life projects without their rights being restricted. And without a doubt, I defend the principle of solidarity and the ethical commitment to development and prosperity for all. You can count on Spain. Pueden contar con España. We want to build the future with you. Queremos construir el futuro con ustedes. We need to transform our world so that no one is left behind. Tenemos que confirmar y transformar nuestro mundo para que nadie quede atrás. Muchas gracias. Many thanks for your attention. Thank you. No lo quiero socar. Gracias.
We get a chance to chat quickly. One thing I was curious about is you introduced a well-being budget in New Zealand, and I wonder how that was received and whether you think other countries could do the same.
Well, I'm obviously going to be completely biased. Perhaps it's the New Zealand media contingent that you should ask who's in the room. You know, I think for us it was a way of demonstrating what it looks like when you move just beyond measures like GDP. And so when we were making our decisions around how we allocated the country's resources, when you start looking beyond simple cost-benefit analysis and actually look at the cost-benefit across human potential, then you start making record investments in things like homelessness and mental health and combating domestic violence and sexual violence. When we just applied an equation that looked at well-being and environmental well-being, then those are the natural outcomes. Those are the natural decisions you make. We have started trying to profile that work. Now, it was the first for us and we'll keep doing it, but I do hope that other countries look to it as a potential model.
Prime Minister Sanchez, I understand that about 2/3 of your cabinet are women.
Yes.
And, yeah. Can you tell us why is that, and why do you think that's important, not just for your country, but for the world?
Well, I am a feminist politician. I'm really proud and honored to lead a government with 65% of its members women, and not the traditional areas where women lead ministers. But a finance minister, budget minister, energy and ecological transition department, defense, vice presidents. And the important thing that we made is to take into account that gender equality is not a sectorial, let's say, policy. It's a horizontal policy. And that is why we place it at the top of the government, at the vice presidency level. And that is why we pass legislation on many issues. But the important thing is that we give a gender equality perspective to all policies that we pass before the national parliament. And this is, I think, is crucial. And this is the let's say, the innovation that we put in place in the Spanish government action.
Both of you are leaders by example of leading from your values. And yet so much, I think, of the headlines that are dominated today are by leaders who are kicking up fear or other issues that are negative about the world. How can the goalkeepers here or young people who are watching learn to lead with their values? How did you all come to that? And what would you want to say to them as leaders?
I'd say that we've probably all grown up with assumptions about what leadership is. And I'll just use the example of politics, because obviously that's the era I know. But you know, if I were to say to you, close your eyes and think of a politician, and now think of their character traits, and maybe even think about what they might look like. Now, when I do this example at home, we're a very brutally honest people in New Zealand. People will chuck character traits out to me that are not flattering, but that are honest. You know, they'll say assertive, aggressive, you know, ego, liars, you know, things that people associate with politics. And so I think if someone's thinking then, well, then if that's my assumption about what political leadership looks like, then is that a reflection of who I am? And if it's not, I won't pursue that. And also, equally, I think then if you're already in politics and you don't behave in those ways, or perhaps if you take a more empathetic approach or you're not particularly aggressive, then the assumption is that you won't succeed or that you're not a successful politician. I think we're in a period of transition. I'd like to think that we are, where now there's greater space for people to be their own kind of leader, where you actually can be compassionate and empathetic, and that can still be perceived as strength and courage, and that you can show kindness, but you can also show steel and determination. And I think the more that we model those traits, the more we model the traits we try to teach our children, and yet we somehow shed off when we become leaders on a world stage. The more we model that, the more people will see themselves and think, I could do that too. So we just need to be our imperfect, flawed selves. And then that will mean that more people will see themselves.
I agree. Well, first of all, I think that we must be clear in our statements. I think that when you hear some of the statements of some political leaders, for example, yesterday before the UN Assembly, General Assembly, you know, you have like a negative perspective of politics and the situation of global politics. But I think that we must be clear also, sending our message, telling the people that, you know, that politics is must give hope to the people, positive solutions, constructive solutions to the global challenges that we have ahead. No? If we give hope instead of negative emotions and endogamic responses to these global challenges that we have, I do believe that people will increase their confidence in politics. So hope, determination, be really clear in our statements with very strong values in what in my view, are the main principles, which are the French Revolution principles. No? Freedom, equality, and fraternity. Sometimes, many times we focus on equality, and freedom, and we forget that the main principle nowadays in this global world that we're living is fraternity. I do believe that we need to be more empathetic and defend strongly this principle, fraternity. This is the future of our planet.
Well, from Bill and me and everybody that's watching and in the room, we want to say thank you to you both for showing a values-based leadership and how you're leading in the world, not just in your own countries, but in the world. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You'd think we'd have equality figured out by now. We talk about it enough. We put it on our flags, buildings, and currency. We fight and sacrifice for it. And we have made stunning progress. Still holds true. Where you are born determines your future. Like this baby, or this baby, or these babies, or this one. But the odds that the baby born here will celebrate her 5th birthday are 50 times higher than the odds that the baby born here will. Until all babies have an equal opportunity to lead a healthy and productive life, the moral principle we all believe in will not be a reality for all 7.5 billion people on Earth. It is on us to keep accelerating progress until every child has the same odds. Let's change the odds.
Goalkeepers, please give a warm welcome for James Chau.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I'm so happy to be with you here. I'm James Chau. I'm the host of the show, The China Current, and I'm the World Health Organization Goodwill Ambassador for Sustainable Development Goals and Health. But much more importantly, like you, I'm a goalkeeper. I'm thrilled to be the host of your session, and on a day when we've come together with the intent to move towards the SDGs, which are bold and brave targets to help reshape the well-being of humanity. You and I are here because we actually believe we can do that, we can reach those targets, but no one person, organization, or country can do it alone. And that's why we call it the global goals. So this is what we have to do. We need to work together, we need to share our strengths, and more importantly, I think we need to support each other in our weaknesses. But we also have to remind ourselves that if we do this right, and if we really go for it, we can change the future. Isn't that exciting? So you're watching that video just there about where you were born determining your future. Here's a bit about me. I was born in London, a global city in a very well-resourced country, and in circumstances that gave me the best of life imaginable. And when I say best of life, this is what I mean. Not having to worry about where I was going to get my healthcare, my education, and also having a really loving family around me all the time. But none of that was to do with me. That was something to do with chance. At the same time, I was different in countless ways from those among whom I lived and studied. And while those differences were also the work of chance, the stigma attached to them meant that I grew up deeply depressed. Meanwhile, the AIDS crisis was exploding all around the world, and the stigma I was living with helped me recognize the gross injustice of the separate stigma attached to those impacted by this disease. It was because of this that I began my work in HIV and AIDS, and where better to do that than in China, where I live and home to the biggest chunk of humanity. So what have I learned? I've learned that through work, chance has a great deal of influence over our lives and our future. But we also have to believe that we have more power than she does if we choose to use it, and if we also decide to change the odds. Over the next hour, we're going to explore how to do that and how the next steps we take can bring us actually closer to the beautiful global future we all imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker is our co-host and the original goalkeeper. How many people can say that? Please welcome Bill Gates.
Well, I'm going to talk about equality. Equality is super important, but I'm going to explain why equality alone is not the goal. Don't get me wrong, equality is super important, but by itself, it's not enough. So let me show you some data going back all the way to 1800 to make clear what I mean by this. We're starting all the way back in 1800 and looking at life expectancy. And as you can see, grouped by continents, they're very close together. Life is not very long. People were pretty much equal, and we don't want to go back to that equality because most of the people in the room here would be dead in that situation. But if we look forward, we see these lines change a lot. By 1910, life expectancy in Europe and the Americas has gone up quite dramatically, but it has not gone up in Africa and Asia. In other words, some very positive progress in some areas created inequality between those places and the rest of the world. So where are we today? Well, in the last 100 years, there's been a massive improvement in life expectancy on every continent. You can see a little wiggle there in the line for Africa, which shows that when the HIV crisis hit, life expectancy actually went down for a period until we learned how to do a better job both preventing it and treating it. Now, no matter where you're born, you'll live quite a bit longer than ever before. But you still see there's a substantial gap. About 16 years there, and that's just not fair. Being born in a particular location shouldn't be the thing that determines how long you live. So our task is to close that gap. And when we do, we won't just have equality like in 1800, we'll have life being better in absolute terms for everyone. So that's where we're trying to go, progress and equality. Now, a lot of this comes through thinking about the babies being born. Since I started talking, we've got over 800 babies have been born. And every time you see a dot flash up on this global map, that's a new birth. And what the color is showing, it's talking about what their lives are going to be like. At last year's Goalkeepers conference, we focused on the importance of health, nutrition, and education as the things that will determine what your life is like. Those factors make up what we call human capital, and it's key to prosperity in every community in the entire world. And so we're coding those dots by human capital. The green dots are for a child who's born in a place where they're likely to get great health support, have great nutrition, and lots of education. And the red dots are if you're born in an area where those resources are going to be very, very limited, and then yellow is in the middle. As you can see, just that location you're born in determines your likely course. And so for the next few minutes, we're going to dive into this idea of geography. Let's look at this at the country level. So here we're taking two factors, the child survival rate, what percentage die before the age of 5, that's on the health x-axis there, y-axis, sorry, and then on the x-axis you have years of education. And so you want to be in the upper right, that is no childhood deaths and 18 years of education. If you're down lower and to the left, that's not good. So this is showing the year 2000, and now we're going to fast forward and see how it shifts as we move up to 2017. And we're going to color the dots where there's been an improvement on both health and education as green, and countries that didn't progress we're going to show as red. And so what you're going to see is a lot of movement up and to the right, and actually only 2 countries, Syria and Dominica, that didn't improve on both metrics. There's another 3 countries that are war-torn that we don't have the recent data for. But overall what we see is that virtually every country has improved. And I was surprised. I'm an optimist. You know, I work on these numbers a lot. But when I saw that, I actually asked the team to go back and really look hard and see if that's the case. But they're quite sure. So that's very good news. Now, we do have, this is the less good news, quite a gap there. So we're all green, but the absolute differences are still quite dramatic. So even though health and education are getting better in almost every country, the gap between the best off and the worst off is very, very large. And that's our job, to drive equality. So we have to understand this gap and why the progress in closing it is a lot slower than we'd like. Now, to look at this, we're going to take what we've shown in white now, the high-income countries, take them off, and just focus on developing countries. And we're going to do something that's quite phenomenal, never done before, but with our partner IHME, this is for the first time been done. We're going to look at the subnational level. So here we're seeing about 17,000 dots. These districts are inside the developing countries, and this is what a new analysis and new sources of data have allowed us to do. These subnational regions, actually in India, are called districts. In Nigeria, they're called LGA, local government areas. In the United States, they're counties. In a lot of places, this is about 200,000 people, and so looking at this level gives you far more accuracy than just looking at a country as though it's monolithic. You know, if we looked at the US just at the country level, we'd see it's very different than if we look at Manhattan versus other districts. So I think there's a lot more insight to be had here. And now let's do the same thing of indicating which of those districts in green improved in both measures and which of them in red did not. And here, you know, it's really phenomenal. You've got 99% of districts have improved. There are some red districts, but not a huge number. And so, you know, this is a message that often doesn't come across. The world is getting better, even in the very toughest places. Child survival, literacy, nutrition, but this district data is very actionable. It means that in addition to being able to take best practices from one country to another, now we can see the opportunity to do something that should be even easier, which is taking best practices from one part of a country to another. So now we're just looking at India. These are all the districts there. India, of course, is the world's biggest developing country. And what we can see here is that the better off districts are doing very well. In fact, I'll highlight a specific one, which is Vellore, which is in the south in Tamil Nadu. And there, what we're seeing for education and child survival is almost the same as what you would see in a rich country. Vellaure's in between Bangalore and Chennai. And you can see it's not all by itself up there. There's a lot of districts in India that are very high performing. In Vellore, 98 of 100 children live to see their 5th birthday. And most of the kids get a very good high school education. But other districts in India are more like far poorer countries. For example, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where our foundation has a long running partnership to work on improving health and nutrition, there are some districts that are still behind. Budawan, for example, it's almost 10% of children don't live until their 5th year. And most of the kids won't get an education past primary school. So this comparison, although it's quite stark, shows a huge opportunity. You know, India's committed to take federal resources and focus them on these districts that are behind. And the practices that are going on up in Vellore of the health system and the teacher training, those we should be able to get everywhere in the country. And so this is another dimension that we can drive. Right now, India isn't on track to achieve the SDGs, but Vellore is on track. In fact, they've achieved them 10 years before the deadline. And so now we have to really understand that, understand the systems approach there, the tools that were used. And this is true worldwide. What I showed here for India in terms of the gaps inside the country are also true for other developing countries. For example, Nigeria is a country that I focus on quite a bit, and it shows the same dramatic differences. So how do we go about transferring best practices? Well, last year I talked about innovations like new seeds and new vaccines. And that work continues, very, very important. But innovation isn't just about the tools, it's also about the systems for delivery. And particularly in education and primary health care, that's a delivery system. And one measure that we have progressed on is getting kids into school. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of children who are not in primary school dropped by more than half. It was 40%, now it's down to 20%. And as we continue to work on that final 20%, though, in parallel, we also have to work on the quality of education. The priority right now is to identify classroom strategies that gives kids basic skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic. On the health side, really closing those gaps depends not so much on hospitals, but rather on primary health care. The basic things like vaccines, antenatal care, that we can get out to every community. And the amazing thing about primary health care is that it can cover most of the gaps in health that we need. And even some of the very poor countries do a great job. So it's definitely affordable. One example of a primary health care system that over the last 20 years has become really very strong is in Ethiopia. This is a country that Melinda and I have been following and engaging with during the entire time we've had the foundation. It was back in 2003 that they put together what they call the Health Extension Program. And they put a health post, like the one we're seeing here, into every village. It's not high-tech at all, it's just the very basic things. They staffed each of these posts with 2 health extension workers who are typically local women that had training in basic health care. They're not doctors, they're not even high-end nurses, but they can still do a lot of the key things. They provide contraceptives and help on family planning. They're very good for prenatal care. They can do simple deliveries, and they're taught how to recognize complications so that those deliveries can be moved to the next level of the health system. Of course, they can give vaccines, hand out bed nets. They have antibiotics, so they can treat diarrhea, antimalarials, pneumonia, all of those things they're very good at. And this system, year by year, has been improving and is now functioning quite well across the entire country. There's 40,000 of those workers, one for every 2,500 people. So let's go back and look at district by district what has happened in health in Ethiopia during this time frame, starting in 2003 going to today, with their under 5 mortality. You can see at the start, 2003, the numbers are pretty bad, up to almost 20%, and quite a gap, about 14% between the best and the worst. If we look at those numbers today, we see two fantastic things. The dots move to the right, and so now you have very few districts that are even up close to 10%, and the gap is much less. It's a 6% gap between the very best and the worst. And so we have made progress, and we've driven equality, the type of equality that we want to see. So now we'll go back to the world map, and as I've been talking now, we're up past 4,000 of these dots, 4,000 kids be born. And so, you know, again, I want to ask, what will their lives be like? Our foundation really is focused on the belief that we shouldn't have red dots or even yellow dots. We want every dot there, every birth, which represents a human being, to have the basic opportunities that we take for granted. Everyone has different dreams, but these basic needs like health and education give everyone a chance to achieve those dreams. And you're goalkeepers because you dream of this better, more equal world. And so we need to build it together. We need to change the odds. Thank you.
Bill, that was a fascinating glimpse at how we can actually achieve progress. But I want to ask you this and maybe push you a little bit. Where's the proof and what's the proof for being optimistic about closing the gaps that you identified for us there?
Well, certainly, you know, what was done in Ethiopia is very possible to do. The resources that were expended really were about the training, the measurement, making sure that those workers had a career path. We saw as we went on, there were some areas like Somalia and Afar where you have more migratory people. It was very hard to achieve the goals there, and so some special tactics were required. But you know, it's great that we have a lot of A students in the development world. It is a tough game though, because the ones that do well, the Indias, Vietnams, Indonesia, they tend to graduate. And of course, what we're left to focus on are those countries which have the biggest challenges. But by taking the best practices from those countries or inside these countries, really we can make far more rapid progress.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Gates. Well, when you see data that Bill gave us, it's hard not to be hopeful. But being hopeful is one thing, and actually planting that hope in the soil of our reality is quite another. I now have the honor of welcoming someone who is doing just that. Joining us now, Dr. Amanda de Souza.
Good morning. My name is Samantha, and I'm from São Paulo, Brazil. In my lifetime, through better genetics and agronomy, my home state has seen a huge increase in productivity on farms. We have gone from quite low yields to yields like those in the most productive regions of the United States. I want to see the same thing happen in other parts of the world, in particular with a crop that originated in Brazil, cassava. Cassava is a tropical crop that produces large tuberous roots with a high concentration of starch. Here in the United States, you have probably eaten cassava as the bubbles of a bubble tea or a tapioca pudding. Or if you are on a gluten-free diet, then cassava is most likely the source of starch on your food. I personally prefer my cassava deep fried. However, in other parts of the world, cassava is a staple. This is especially true for sub-Saharan Africa, where about 500 million people depend on cassava as their main food source. For smallholder farmers who depend on tiny plots of land to feed and support their families, cassava is a backup crop when other crops fail. Especially for women who represent a majority of smallholder farmers, cassava is a savings account. It's a resource they can harvest all year to pay for things like medical treatment and their children's school fees. Despite cassava's importance, however, research and development has been neglected. As a result, cassava yields have not significantly risen in Africa. In Nigeria, which grows more cassava than any other country, current yields are the same as in 1960s. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is predicted to increase by 2 times in the next 30 years. According to current projections, this means either an escalation of a food shortage that's already critical, or a huge increase in prices. History tells us that such situations, besides leading to hunger, result in civil conflict and mass migration. On top of population growth, we have the climate crisis, which is predicted to be particularly severe in this area. This means that we need to produce at least double the amount of food to feed all these people. But the problem is that any new variety we develop, it takes at least 15 years to get from the lab to farmers. We need to increase cassava yields today. As a scientist, this is the kind of challenge I wanted to address. One that once solved can change the world for the better. And that's why, despite the very critical situation, I and many colleagues around the globe wake up every day and work hard. Because we are confident that we can find technological solutions, as we did with the Green Revolution that spared the world from starvation in the last century. So, how to increase cassava yields? A big part of the progress towards the next Green Revolution will also come from breeding and genetic improvements. I am working on the RIPE project to improve the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis has more than 170 steps, but simply put, is the process by which plants use carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water to produce sugars. The plant then uses these sugars to grow. Photosynthesis is the source, directly or indirectly, of all our food. However, even in our most developed crops, photosynthetic efficiency is less than 1/3 of its potential. I want to close this gap in cassava. But which of the more than 170 steps of photosynthesis needs improvement? To find out, we use computational modeling to identify possible bottlenecks. We also collect data using equipment like this. We place a leaf inside this chamber, where we can control light, carbon dioxide, temperature, and relative humidity. Inside the head of this machine, there are sensors that measures all these variables. Software then reads those measurements and tell us how much photosynthesis is occurring in the leaf and how much water it's using. Our models and data from this machine allow us to determine the limitations and effective ways to improve photosynthesis for higher yields with less water. The very good news is that we already know that at least 3 of the processes we have identified as bottlenecks can increase productivity up to 40% in tobacco. Tobacco, of course, sounds like a strange choice, but we use tobacco as a test bed because it's easier to change genetically and it produces thousands of seeds per plant, allowing us to quickly find out if a change results in more productivity. If it does, then we start translating the genetic improvement to cassava. Our work has given us good evidence that in a few years we are going to have much more productive cassava that will thrive even in the climate crisis. This means that smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, especially women, will produce more food per acre. They will also have a better chance at reaping surpluses that they can sell to pay for things their families need, especially the fees to keep their children in school. But having a cassava plant that produces more, it's not the entire solution. The science is only one piece of a huge system. This system includes scientists, but also policymakers, politicians, lawyers, crop breeders, seed suppliers, and others, including influencers like you. We are privileged. We have so much knowledge we can use to help those in the most need. We can utilize the power of innovation to guarantee that food will be available to make life better for everyone. Thank you.
Amanda, I was just standing over there backstage. I think it's amazing to think that we can improve upon something as fundamental as photosynthesis. And that's the kind of innovation that Bill was talking about there that can really carry us into the future. But one question for you, what can you do to better cassava? What do you see for the future?
Well, I mean, at this point right now, we already have like baby cassava plants with our first genetic improvement. Like they are, we got them with the photosynthesis improved. So next steps are keep working with them and analyzing them to see if we can see the same benefits that we saw in tobacco in cassava. And we are really hopeful for that.
We're hopeful with you. Thank you, Dr. Amanda de Souza.
Thank you.
So Dr. de Souza is working to make resources in developing countries more fruitful, while our next speaker is trying to get those countries more access to the resources we find in developed nations. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Senjuti Saha.
So it turns out Bill Gates and I have a lot in common. We both love maps, data, and dots. Here is our world. Red dots show where majority of the children die. Now let's overlay in green the places where the best and the latest technologies exist. Note the gap. 90% of children die where 10% of all resources exist. This is unacceptable and another example of inequality. At our organization, the Child Health Research Foundation in Bangladesh, this is the gap we strive to close. So let me give you 2 examples of this inequality. Every year, Dhaka Shishu Hospital, the largest pediatric hospital of the country, admits more than 23,000 children. But also every year, more than 6,000 children are refused admission because the 665 beds are always full. Families travel for hours with children suffering from birth asphyxia, meningitis, pneumonia, the most vulnerable who need immediate care. But by the time they arrive, the hospital is at full capacity. If we prevent any disease, we keep a bed empty. And if we keep a bed empty, we can provide care to a child with a disease we could not prevent. And the faster we can treat a child and make them healthier, the quicker we can make that bed available for the next child. This brings me to the second example of this inequality gap. How do you prevent diseases or treat them effectively when you don't know what is causing them? Let's consider meningitis. Meningitis is an infection of the brain, usually caused by a bacterium or a virus. It often leads to death, but even more often, it leads to lifelong disability. And in a country like ours, a disabled child translates to a disabled family, a disabled community. If you know which microbe caused the meningitis, you can develop a diagnostic tool, and often you can treat it or figure out how to prevent it in the future. But in the 2,000 meningitis cases that seek care at our hospital every year, we are unable to determine the cause in more than 50%. This means we are paralyzed, unable to diagnose, unable to treat. And I'm not speaking in the abstract. Just in the summer of 2017, we encountered a surge in the number of mystery meningitis cases. The samples we took baffled every diagnostic we had access to. And I became quickly frustrated because I knew if I had been in Canada, where I studied, we could have used the advanced techniques common in rich countries. One such tool or technique is called metagenomics. So metagenomics unbiasedly sequences all of the DNA or RNA present in the cerebrospinal fluid, or the CSF, that is present in our spinal cord attached to our brain. All organisms in this world contain DNA or RNA. By analyzing that sequence data intelligently, we can pinpoint the pathogen. The CSF of a child with meningitis will contain that bacterium or the virus at the root of that infection. But we lacked a machine sophisticated enough to sequence the samples. And even if we did have the machine, the manual analysis would cost thousands of dollars, which we did not have. 90% of the resources to treat diseases like meningitis exist in rich countries where meningitis is rare. Meanwhile, places like Bangladesh have the most kids suffering and dying from these diseases and the least resources to diagnose and take care of them. This is our reality. Supportive collaborators like Joseph Dirisi and Farhad Imam made it possible for me to use a machine in San Francisco and analyze the data. So I took 25 samples from Bangladesh and went to the United States, came to the United States and sequenced them thoroughly. What I learned defied our common medical wisdom. That spike in mystery meningitis cases that we saw in the summer of 2017 was caused by chikungunya virus, a virus spread by mosquitoes. This made sense. We had recently had a chikungunya fever outbreak. Now that we knew that metagenomics could indeed unravel mystery meningitis cases of Bangladesh, we began the work of transferring the entire pipeline from San Francisco to Bangladesh. That's me in July 2018 in San Francisco, sequencing a CSF sample. That's me again just 7 months later in Dhaka. In Dhaka, sequencing another one using our own machine. The move was not easy. As you can see, I lost most of my hair in the process. But when we set up the metagenomics shrine in our lab and a core metagenomics team, I knew it was worth it. With the clues that metagenomics provided us, we were able to design a low-cost diagnostic in Bangladesh to test 500 more samples of meningitis. What we found was that the mystery meningitis cases had actually followed the curve of the fever cases that I had just talked about. Along with the chikungunya fever outbreak, we had a chikungunya meningitis outbreak that no one had noticed. Unfortunately, chikungunya does not have a treatment yet, but it is preventable by mosquito control and vaccines are on the way. And really, metagenomics can help us with a lot more than just meningitis. Actually, we are using it right now to get to the bottom of a dengue outbreak, trying to determine what are the exact types of dengue viruses circulating in the country. The information and the data that we are gathering from such techniques better equip us to guide evidence-based policy decisions for treatment or introduction of existing vaccines, or even help guide the design of future vaccines. When we prevent one case of meningitis, we free up a bed to care for another child. In our whatever small way, we try to take some weight off our struggling health systems. Both my parents are microbiologists. They say, microbiology is in my genes. Both my parents are also very patient. Patience is not in my genes. My father started work 40 years ago to prove to the world that Bangladeshi children were dying from Haemophilus influenzae type B, or Hib meningitis. 19 years after the Hib vaccine was introduced in the US, my father helped bring it to our country, where it now prevents the deaths of 3,100 infants every year. But my father had to work patiently for years before this could happen. I am way too impatient to wait for years. I want to build a landscape of all circulating pathogens and help the global and local community prevent diseases in real time. In 1971, Bangladesh struggled to feed 70 million people. Today, we are almost 170 million. We feed every Bangladeshi and export the remaining food. So we can do this, we can do metagenomics or whatever else. But we need your help. I urge all of you, all the goalkeepers in the audience, to join me, to help us reduce that gap in access to resources that I have been talking about. Our children should not suffer for one extra day because of lack of technology that already exists, be it metagenomics or something else. Sometimes more important than a brand new innovation is its utilization where it is needed the most. Let's change the map of the world so it looks like this. All
Isn't it really beautiful? We had that map from Bill, then we saw these green dots sprinkling right across it. It was amazing. But I'm curious about another thing over here, because you mentioned a lot about your work over in meningitis, and how is getting to the bottom of the dengue epidemic compared to that? Is it similar or is it very different?
So similar and different. Great question. So similar in the ways that in both cases of metagenomics, we are sequencing every bit of RNA that are in the samples. But the samples are different. In meningitis, the samples are CSF sample from the spinal cord, whereas in dengue, we are using blood samples. But more importantly, when we were working on meningitis, we are working on mystery meningitis, where we have no idea what pathogen was causing it, what bacterium, virus, fungus, whatever. But in case of dengue, we knew it was dengue fever. What we wanted to understand is which type of virus exactly, because it's hard and resource intensive to grow viruses in our setting. So, metagenomics gives us this way of getting a glimpse of the genome and really pinpointing which dengue virus it is and guide evidence-based policy decisions, let's say vaccine introduction.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Senjuti Saha. So let's do a quick stock take over here, because Dr. Saha is working to heal sick people, but healing illness, as we all know, is only one aspect of health. There's another critical aspect that's drawn lots of attention in recent years, and it's called nutrition. Those of you who are working to ensure that all people are adequately nourished will know the outstanding work of the Aliko Dangote Foundation. And in a few minutes, we'll hear from Suhair Yusufu, a woman fiercely dedicated to the health, education, and prosperity of Africans. First, let's watch a quick film.
Thank you, James, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. My name is Suhair Yusufu, and I'm the Managing Director and CEO of the Aliko Dangote Foundation. I want to tell you about the first time that I saw a severely and acutely malnourished child. I was shocked. He was 2 years old, but he was the size of a 6-month-old infant. His skin was peeling off so badly that at first I thought he was a burn victim. He was trying to cry, but it was coming out as a whimper because he simply didn't have the energy. He was too malnourished to cry. I wanted to weep, but I didn't. And I asked his mother to tell me about him. He was always fine, she said, but then he got a cough, and then he got diarrhea, and ever since then, he's been like this. This woman did not understand. She didn't understand that her child was malnourished. She didn't understand why he was sick. She didn't understand that her child, even if he survived, would soon reach the age at which any intervention would come too late. She didn't have the community support. The policies and systems to help her understand what was happening were simply not in place. And this hospital was on a main road in Nigeria between Kano and Katsina, 2 large cities in the north of the country. So if a child at a well-funded hospital on a busy highway was this sick, what must a child in a rural hospital be suffering? Today, as I speak to you, there are 2 million children in Nigeria, just like the one I saw that day. And the Aliko Dangote Foundation's mission is to bring that number down to 0. Now, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce 2 friends who are working the hardest to make that happen. We're about to have a conversation with them in a very fast 10 minutes that by rights should take at least a day, if not a week, so hold on to your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Aliko Dangote, President and Chief Executive of Dangote Industries Limited and Chairman of the Aliko Dangote Foundation. And Bill Gates, Co-Chair, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Good. It's my boss. So, The first question that I will ask is to Mr. Aliko Dangote, Alhaji, as we call him. Alhaji, your goal is for children to lead healthy, productive lives no matter where they're born. How does nutrition, specifically fortification, fit in to this question?
Well, thank you very much, Zora and Bill. It's great to be here. I think one of the greatest factors that undermine progress is malnutrition, which a lot of kids, they don't really have access to enough food and also nutritious food. So, but what we have done in Nigeria, because it's not new, we've started this a very, very long time ago, because if you look at it, for example, to do with iodization started in Nigeria in 1993. At that time, the coverage was about 40%. And by 2005, we had already reached about 95% of coverage. And as we speak today, we have reached 98% of coverage in iodization. On food, what we have done to make sure there's, how do we get good, nutritious food to the society? So what we did in 2002, when we first started refining of sugar, we were the first company in Africa to introduce fortification into sugar, because it took us a long time to be able to figure out, okay, at what point do you actually apply the fortification? So what we did was we worked with the Standard Organization of Nigeria, we worked with UNICEF, and also some technical people to see, okay, fine, how do we really create these equipments where they will now dose the vitamins at the end of it so that our children will be able to consume that. With that one, now government brought out the policy where all these food items, majority of them like sugar, wheat products, which means flour, pasta, noodles, vegetable oil, and then the sugar, all of this, they brought out regulations where they say that it is mandatory to apply vitamin fortification. So majority, all the companies now in Nigeria, what we do is that we are fortifying all these products so that children will be able to, to access this without, going to drugstore or whatever. And with this, 80% of all the companies that produce food were very, very pleased, and we want to thank Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for calling for a general meeting for everybody to sign up and say that, yes, they will continue to fortify their food products. So that is how we are now getting that. On the other side, on Aliko Dangote Foundation, what we are doing, we are actually, we have what you call integrated nutrition program, of which now we are trying to, I'm sure Zora must have spoken about it, we are now going to make sure that, yes, we access minimum, we take out 2 million children out of being malnourished. So it's one of the things that the foundation is doing. But right now, Dangote is also in the process of rice milling. We are setting up about 1 million tons of rice, and all our rice will apply these nutritious, vitamins. So this one, because the main food that we eat in Nigeria is mainly rice. People eat rice in the morning, they eat rice in the afternoon, they eat rice at night. So with this, we are now trying to introduce something, and also we are going to the government to make it mandatory for all the rice that we consume in Nigeria to be fortified. So this will help quite a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Bill, you and Alhaji have a lot of influence. We all know this. But to achieve your nutrition goals, you've chosen to build a coalition of private sector, philanthropy, government, to help achieve these nutrition goals for Nigeria and beyond. So what is the role of this broader coalition in your food fortification work?
Well, it's pretty important that we focus more on nutrition, because about 40% of the kids who do survive end up not with physical or mental development. And a big part of that can be reduced with this food fortification. But to really get it right, you've got to make sure the requirements are there, the government's able to go out and measure it, so that they make sure nobody's trying to save a little money by not doing this well. The greatest example was what was done with salt, the iodine enhancement there. Globally, that's been a huge advance, and that's reduced the cretinism that resulted from that iodine deficiency. Now we're taking 5 additional micronutrients where the costs are actually quite small, vitamin D, iron, B12, that have very positive benefits. And we're trying to make sure in every country that the typical diet that a child will have, whether it's rice or bouillon or flour, that across those staples, they get every single one of these micronutrients.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now we'll take questions from members of our Goalkeepers Advisory Board. And we'll start with Angel Adelaja of Fresh Direct, Nigeria. Angel?
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to see that Nigerian private sector is so actively pushing the global goals. My question is that with the difficulty that smallholder farmers in Nigeria have in meeting the needs of agro-processors, can you discuss a little bit about what the Dangote Foundation and the Gates Foundation have been doing to help include smallholder farmers in the process?
Well, thank you very much, the lady from Nigeria. What we are doing in Dangote Foundation, we are making sure that the growth of our rice, we get all these outgrowers, small, outgrowers to be involved. And then we have already arranged, where the banks will fund these small outgrowers. For example, our entire rice for the 1 million will actually be done by these outgrowers. So, which means we are going to create wealth, among them, and we'll give them the rice seedlings, we give them the implements, we give them the fertilizer, of course, which we are now, going to start making from January. And then at the end of the day, they will sell the rice to us. But if our price is not right, they can go and sell to anybody. So that's what we have. On the sugar, what we are doing is that we are going to control about 60%. About 40% of that will be done by also outgrowers. So we already have integrated them right into our own system, and it will really, really empower them. That's what we are doing at the moment.
Excellent. And Bill?
Well, the priority on smallholders is that it's a great question, because for some crop types, that's very easy to achieve where you help them with the inputs. Other crop types, it's a little more difficult. But the key measure is the productivity and the economics improving for those smallholders, where particularly in the north of Nigeria, that the whole equation, if we're going to fix nutrition, we have to help those farmers.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And next we'll hear from Alex Holmes, founder of Anti-Bullying Ambassadors, based in the UK and Ireland.
Thank you very much. You're both great goalkeepers, but you're also fantastic friends. I'd love to know, what do you know now through the collaboration that you wish you'd known at the start of your journey? And I'm sure we'd all also love to know the most surprising thing you've found out about each other or you've learned about each other.
Okay, well, let me try and go first. Well, for me, I think when I started my foundation in 1994, I never really, realized that, we had this massive challenge in our health sector. Really, it was a mind-boggling when we now had this, agreement to now cooperate and have collaboration with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that really opened up my eyes to realize that, look, there are a lot of challenges in health. And honestly, you know, one of the things that made me to be very, very shocked and surprised, you know, at that time I hadn't really had the opportunity of meeting Bill or even interacting with him. But meeting Bill, it actually now made me totally a different person, thinking that, yes, you know, this is somebody who really has nothing to do with us, for example, in Africa or Nigeria, but he's putting his money, his soul, everything. He's very, very committed at helping humanity. That really surprises me, you know. I mean, it surprised me a lot about Bill. And, you know, I realized that, you know, he's a very simple person. I never knew that Bill was going to be this simple. And I thought he's a very, very tough guy, but, you know, very soft-spoken and, you know, kind-hearted. It is really very difficult to find people like Bill in this world. Bill, we're grateful.
Thank you.
And, you know, I can assure you now, I believe that, yes, with my association with you, my only prayer is that in the next few years, I will try and give a chunk of my wealth to also charity.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun when we got to know each other. We would be traveling around Lagos, where the traffic gives you lots of time to sit and talk sometimes. And, you know, I'd be showing Aliko my charts about, hey, Sokoto has a pretty low vaccination rate, you know, and Kano needs to do this. And Aliko, he really knows people. He has relationships. He's willing to reach out to people. So he'd say, hey, let's call the governor, you know, and we'll talk to him about this. And sure enough, you know, next thing you know, we've got the governor of Sokoto on the phone. We're talking about this. And so this ability now to reach out, to draw on the broad relationships that Aliko's developed. And, you know, I'm pretty shy about calling people. I just want to mail them my charts. But in fact, what's come out of that is that Aliko and I do a video conference call with 6 of the governors in the northern states, where twice a year we look at vaccine coverage. You know, is the supply chain working? Are the workers showing up? Are the healthcare posts in the right locations? And it's a big challenge, but really drawing on Aliko's communication skills and the fact that he's not afraid to call anyone. Everyone he wants to talk to him. It's been phenomenal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wasn't this amazing? Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aliko, Bill, and Suhair. And thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Gates, for creating Goalkeepers and allowing us to change the odds through it. Dear friends, you shared the last hour with us, and for committing to a more prosperous, more equitable global future. I hope you found this hour as useful and enlightening as I have, because the global goals make it very clear about what we must do now in order for our children, our children's children, and their children's children to live in the kind of world we can only imagine right now. It's now my honor to introduce the Special Advisor to the Executive Director of Global Policy at One and the founder of She-Tank, a modern think tank dedicated to the realization of SDG 5 in Africa through thought leadership and through advocacy. Ladies and gentlemen, Blessing Omakwu.
In 1951, America's most prestigious orchestras were dominated by male musicians. For example, the Boston Symphony Orchestra featured just 1 woman and 102 men. The orchestra, to its credit, recognized there was something very wrong with this picture. So they changed their audition process. They constructed a giant curtain. Musicians auditioned on one side, while the music director judged their performances on the other. The hope was that if the music director couldn't see who was auditioning, his decisions would be gender blind. But still, the majority of musicians who made the cut were still men. You see, the music director couldn't see gender behind the curtain, but he could hear it in the clickety-clack of a pair of high heels. And despite the music director's good intentions, his subconscious influenced how he judged the audition. So another step was added to the process. Carpets were rolled across the floor to conceal footsteps that could conceal the gender of the musician. And if there were no carpets, musicians took off their shoes. And that, folks, is when things really started to change. Please give it up for our musicians, Jonathan Dinklage, Philip and Peyton, and Frederick Naiman. One more round of applause for them. This example of orchestra auditions illustrates a sobering reality. Despite our best intentions, our deeply embedded assumptions about race, tribe, gender, class, and more can shape what we see, what we hear, and how we act. Bias affects every aspect of life, from who gets called back for a job interview, to who gets sent to prison, to who gets cast on The Real Housewives. Fortunately, there are ways to address bias, as this example shows us. Today, blind auditions are nearly universal, and women sit in 46% of orchestra chairs across this country. It strikes me, though, that the only way for women to gain access to orchestras is to be unseen. Their opportunity rests on their invisibility. About a decade ago, I began law school at a predominantly white institution in Washington, D.C. And a few days before classes began, I joined other black students for an annual retreat organized by the Black Alumni Association. One piece of advice we got: be careful about wearing ethnic hairstyles at internship interviews. The alumni spoke from a place of their own painful experience with prejudice. It was one of many times as a Nigerian American woman I was reminded it is often easier to make that which is different invisible. For so long and for so many minorities around the world, being included and even staying safe has required shape-shifting, code switching, masking, performing. Today we are going to look at how we experience and perpetuate bias as individuals, and how individual biases contribute to the systemic inequities at the root of every sustainable development goal. We'll be exploring bias in a variety of contexts, including, for the very first time at Goalkeepers, a deep dive into work that needs to be done right here in the United States. I'll be honest, these kinds of conversations aren't easy, and they certainly are not comfortable. But uncomfortable conversations are often the most important ones. Policy and funding are fundamental tools for realizing the SDGs. But unless we face our prejudices head-on, unless we reframe our perceptions, we risk changing outward structures without changing the underlying systems that sustain inequality. And here's the thing. With 11 years left to achieve the global goals, invisibility as a means of inclusion is no longer enough. It's a testament to the Gates Foundation that we're having this conversation today, and that I'm standing in front of you as your host. Melinda Gates could have moderated her session, and we all know she would have been absolutely brilliant at it. But today she has yielded her platform and created space for a woman like me and for people who come from completely different backgrounds than hers to be heard and to be seen. Like many of you, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for her leadership. Please join me in welcoming Melinda back to the stage.
Well, thank you so much to Blessing for opening this session. And Blessing is completely right. Bias is very hard to talk about. And in fact, it's hard to talk about because it is a very big topic. It's as wide and it's as deep as humanity. And it's everything that Blessing said. It's about race. It's about gender. It's about tribe. It's about class. And what we know is that it can show up absolutely anywhere. I was reading an article recently in the newspaper and last month, and it was about a female lawmaker. She was ejected from Kenya's parliament because she brought her child to the floor of parliament. Bias is also responsible for much of our, it's showing up in much of our lives. I think an industry that many of us are touched by every single day is tech. And in the tech industry, we know that only 3 out of every 100 startups receiving venture capital funding have women at the helm. We also know that Black and Latino women combined only make up 4% of all jobs in Silicon Valley large tech companies. And of course, bias is also at the heart of the story that Blessing shared with us. In fact, I believe that bias has likely influenced every single person's life in this room in some way. It's either you might be a victim of it, or you might inadvertently be a perpetrator of bias. So how can we even begin to have a coherent discussion and a productive conversation about a subject that is so far-reaching? We almost need some sort of taxonomy. If we had a cultural anthropologist here, they would probably draw a huge chart for us up on the wall. And at one end might be the most conscious and egregious instances of bias. People of power actively using that power to keep others down. It would be like things like in my own country, Jim Crow. It might be apartheid. It might be laws that say women can't have a bank account or she can't sit behind the wheel of a car. At the other end of bias might be something like the shoeless orchestra that we just heard about. Unconscious bias, right? It was a conductor who was inadvertently hiring people just like himself, but he didn't mean to be doing that. And in between that very wide spaces, the examples of bias run this gamut. They go everywhere from conscious bias to unconscious bias. Everywhere from well-meaning to malicious. So that would be one way we could have this conversation. But lately, I've actually been considering perhaps another way to have this conversation. I was trained as a programmer. I came from the tech industry. And I think a lot about source code. That is the language that operates our software and our systems. And source code, I think, is a useful metaphor because what is coded in our society today, sometimes inadvertently, is bias. Our institutions, our industries, our governments, our communities, they're all run, right, by codes and protocols that have been developed over generations. We're born into these codes and protocols. But when you start looking at them, you see that bias has been embedded everywhere and in different ways. So take those statistics I gave you about the tech industry. Why do they exist? Well, one of the reasons is back in the 1960s, tech companies used to start when they were interviewing programmers with a test called the Cannon-Perry test to test the fit of new employees and identify the best programmers. Two psychologists, very well-meaning, Cannon and Perry, came up with this test, and they did a great thing. They profiled 1,400 programmers to see what was the right profile. The only problem, of that 1,400 sample set, 186 were women. So I doubt that Cannon and Perry intended to skew the gender balance in tech, but for several generations, their test, in part, became part of the problem. So let's consider another industry that's as old as tech is new, agriculture. A few years ago, one of the nonprofits that we work with had this fabulous program. They were donating cows to small farms in Mozambique. But they noticed that these cows that they were donating, despite their best efforts, kept getting sick. So when the organization did some investigation, they saw that the problem that they had was actually in their own program design, and it's not what they intended. In Mozambique, the women take care of the livestock back at home. But the nonprofit hadn't thought about that. They hadn't accounted for it. They had asked for just one person to come and collect the cow. And that's the time when they did the training of how to care for the cow. The person who came to collect the cow was almost always a man. And so the women who were then responsible for caring for the cows back at the farm never received the training at all. And so that nonprofit started to realize an important lesson. In societies that are dominated by men, even programs that are intended to be gender blind actually can output bias if we don't look at who the recipients are. So the idea that so much of our world is biased by design may seem at this point daunting or just like it's all nothing but bad. But I have to say, this actually makes me hopeful. Because if this has been designed into our communities, our professions, and our lives, then guess what? We can undesign it too. We can edit the code. Of course, it's not always as easy or straightforward as a nonprofit changing the way they do training, or the tech sector doing one thing, which is changing their aptitude or abandoning an old aptitude test. These things have gotten baked in. But there are places where bias is more intricately woven into the system, and so those will be hard to edit out. We have to realize that we have bias in our relationships. We have bias even in how we treat our colleagues. It's in the spaces in between the generations where those customs and traditions are passed down. Over the past few years, our foundation has tried to get smarter about how people and organizations confront bias and these intimate examples. And while we're putting a lot of effort into that work, I'll have to be honest, we haven't found a lot of answers yet. We're working on this. But we do know where the answers are going to come from. They'll come from listening to the stories like the ones we'll hear over the next hour. Having courage to look inward, to evaluate our own biases, and then to commit to making change. Bias may be big, but I think addressing it starts right now, and it starts here. Let's start by having some courageous conversations.
Thank you so much, Melinda. Melinda closed with an important point. Bias often manifests on the societal level, in our schools, our courts, our healthcare systems, and more. But bias also enters our day-to-day lives in subtle ways, reinforcing stereotypes often without us even realizing it. Here's an example. Many of you probably send emojis every day without thinking twice about them. They're great. In fact, emoji is the world's fastest growing language, used by more than 90% of the world's online population. But let's think a little bit more deeply about emojis. In 2019, is there really no emoji for a man carrying a baby? And then there's this. For a long time, when you typed CEO into your phone, the emoji keyboard suggested a picture of a man in a suit and a tie. The same was true of CFO, CTO, and so on. And remember how I spoke about ethnic hairstyles a few minutes ago? There still aren't any emojis with afros. Of course, I hear you. Of course, emojis aren't the reason we have gender roles and racial biases. They are a reflection of our biases, though, and a perpetuation of them. Our next speaker has spent years researching how we perceive and interpret signals like this. Her book, Bias, uncovers how hidden prejudice shapes what we see, what we think, and what we do. Please welcome Stanford Professor of Psychology and MacArthur Genius Grant awardee, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to tell you a story. I'm waiting for Iris to appear. This is Iris, okay? Check Iris out. She's 28 years old, and she lives in Los Angeles. She has a pet fish named Columbo, and she's working on her master's degree. She also has a brown belt in Taekwondo. Now, I want you to answer this to yourself silently. Which one is Iris? How many of you said this one? Raise your hand if you said that one. Okay. What about this one? Okay. Well, the second one is right. Did any of you have trouble finding Iris? It's okay to be honest. You had trouble? Okay. All right. I have another story for you. This is Joy. And Joy is 31 years old, and she lives in Boston. She works as an administrator. She has a dog named Willie, and she loves horror movies. Her best friend is her sister, Kate. Now, let's do this again. Which one is Joy? Okay. If you thought this one, you've got the right Joy. All right. And here's the thing. If you got Joy right, there's a better chance that you're Asian. And if it was easy for you to find Iris, there's a good chance that you're white. So what we just demonstrated here is a phenomenon that exists across countries, across cultures, across ethnic groups, and it's called the other race effect. The reality is that typically we all have trouble distinguishing faces of people from races other than our own. And it makes sense, right, if you think about it? Most of us simply have less experience with faces from other races. We see them less frequently at family dinners, at our primary schools, in our hometowns, and so forth. But this isn't just about our environment. The other race effect is actually wired into our brains. The act of perceiving faces is critical to our ability to function as humans. So this highlighted area you see here is the brain's fusiform face area, or FFA, one of multiple places in the bottom back of the brain that helps us to distinguish faces. The FFA helps us to differentiate the familiar from the unfamiliar, the friend from the foe. And over the past few years, working with my team at Stanford University, we've shown that the FFA actually becomes more active, its neurons firing more vigorously when people see faces of their own race. When they see faces from other races, though, the neurons are less active. So what's happening is this. Our experiences are actually tuning our neurons. Our brains are being wired by the people that we surround ourselves with. So it's not just in our minds. It's actually right there in our neural passages, the connections that make it possible for us to categorize familiar, unfamiliar, similar, different, us, them. And this process of categorization doesn't stop at simple identification. It extends to the beliefs and the feelings we attribute and assign to people with certain characteristics. Whether we like it or not, we all carry beliefs and feelings about all sorts of social groups, beliefs that influence our perceptions and our actions, even when we're not aware of it. This is the definition of unconscious bias. It's like the orchestra example Blessing told us about. Now check this out. Take a look at these images. Researchers have found that simply seeing images like this can intensify stereotypes. Seeing a picture of a male police officer, for example, makes you think that men should be police officers and that women should not be. And when our stereotypes are reinforced, even in that simple, subtle way, it can lead women to actually perform differently. For example, let's take another look at Joy. When Joy is subtly reminded of her gender identity before taking a challenging math test, her performance plummets. That's because in the US and in other countries, there exists a stereotype that women are not that good at math, right? Yet when Joy is prompted to think about herself as Asian, her performance rises on that very same math test, right? Same woman, same test, different outcome. That's how deeply ingrained these biases can be. And the thing is this, simply having knowledge of societal beliefs about our group can influence how we perform. We don't have to personally endorse those beliefs. We don't even have to live in a society where those beliefs first emerged. That's how powerful these unconscious biases are. When you think of a lawyer or president, do you think of a male or a female? What about someone cooking dinner over a hot stove? In your mind's eye, when you see a banker, what color is their skin? What about someone in jail? People often say, seeing is believing. But in many cases, believing is seeing. As we go through life, these kinds of connections get wired into our brains day after day, year after year, despite our intentions and without our permission. It's part of being human. It's how we sort and categorize the overload of stimuli that constantly bombard us at any given moment. It brings coherence to a chaotic world. So whether you like it or not, if you have a brain, you have bias. Bias isn't always bad or wrong. It actually helps us to decide to approach the house pet but leave the wild animal alone. So that's a good thing, right? Yeah, bias, it's a marker of our history. It's a marker of where we've been and what we've seen. But left unchecked, unconscious bias can lead to great detriment for social groups and the world that we share. It can shackle us in place. And that's what you'll hear about next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eberhardt. I love the phrase, if you have a brain, you have bias. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that to have biases is to be human. It's what we do with them that matters. Left unchecked, bias doesn't just get embedded in our brains. It can become encoded in the design of nearly everything we create. Earlier, I spoke about emojis. Now, let's talk about the device you use to send them, your cell phones. My first year in university, I had the Motorola Razr phone. Does anyone remember that phone? I would walk around campus with them, and I had these cute pink earpieces. I felt like I had arrived. I mean, first of all, my parents didn't let me have a cell phone for what felt like an eternity. And then back then, the smallest phones were often the coolest phones. But today, the average smartphone is 5.5 inches, designed to fit the largest male hands. The average man can quite easily use his smartphone one-handed, but the average woman's hand is not much bigger than the phone itself. In Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Woman, the smartphone example is just one example of the ways the male body is often treated as the default body. Consider biology textbooks. Male bodies show up much more frequently to illustrate neutral body parts than female bodies do. Male bodies are used more frequently for clinical trials than women's bodies are, even though men and women can react differently to the same medications. Even the mannequins used in automobile safety crash tests are almost exclusively male bodies. All of this has real consequences. It means we have less sex disaggregated data, which leads to women being less likely to receive sound medical advice or respond well to certain medications. It means we're less certain of how and whether women will survive car crashes. And we haven't even gotten to the compounding effects of racial bias. Our next speaker will help us explore this complex intersection. She has received numerous awards from institutions like the Congressional Black Caucus and Harvard University for her unapologetic advocacy for Black women and their bodies. Please welcome Dr. Joya Creer-Perry.
So I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about life, its very beginnings, and too often tragic endings. I'm talking about maternal mortality, women dying during and after childbirth. Over the 20th century in America, the number of women who died in childbirth each year dropped by almost 99%, a feat of modern medicine. And like we do in the United States here, we pat ourselves on the back for this problem solved. And while other countries doubled down on their efforts to meet UN goals surrounding maternal death rates, we stopped paying attention. As a result, today, the US is facing a public health crisis. In the past 2 decades alone, the maternal mortality rate in America has more than doubled. We are the only industrialized nations where rates are actually rising, even though we spend more money on healthcare than any other country. And as is true for so many of the problems we face in this country, Black women, like me, suffer disproportionately. In fact, we are more than 3 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related complications. Here in the beautiful New York City, it's even worse. A Black woman is 12 times more likely to die during or after childbirth than a white woman. What's particularly troubling is this. These disparities persist even when controlling for socioeconomic factors such as income, education, even whether or not a mother has health insurance. So what's going on? I first started asking myself that question after giving birth to my own child. I was in my 4th year of medical school when I went into labor 4 months early, just halfway through my 2nd trimester. My son was born weighing just under a pound. Thankfully today, he's a healthy 20-something-year-old who doesn't call his mother enough, right? Yeah. At the time, I had none of the usual risk factors that accompany premature birth. I was married, I was in medical school, my father is a doctor, my mother's a pharmacist. I barely had any alcohol in the house, well, at least back then. But the truth is, my only risk factor was being Black. But in America, that alone can be the difference between life and death. So I've spent my career just trying to make sense of this injustice. And while my work centers on racism and genderism in the American healthcare systems, these inequalities are born of classism, casteism, tribalism, fundamentalism, paternalism, and on and on. Prejudice, I'm sure you've all seen in your own countries, can take any form. And without a concentrated effort to address it, it will. Here in the United States, this prejudice against Black mothers goes all the way back to the very beginnings of modern gynecology. Dr. J. Marion Sims, historically known as the father of gynecology, began his practice by performing experimental vaginal surgeries without anesthesia on a group of enslaved Black women. Their names were Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. I always try to say their names because their stories deserve to be remembered too. Dr. Sims claimed these experiments were justified because Black women could supposedly endure higher levels of pain than white women. Until just 2 years ago, a statue of Surgeon Sims stood right here, over there in Central Park. Today, the statue's gone. Yay, thanks to activists. But somehow, this cruel notion he perpetuated or not. In 2016, a study at an elite American university showed that a quarter of the school's medical residents believe that Black people have thicker skin than whites. This is not a metaphor. They meant it literally. These are doctors who have graduated and are treating patients. Studies also confirm that when Black people bring up pain to their doctors, they are likely to be dismissed, ignored, or sent home without treatment. But more melanin does not mean we can tolerate more pain. We know this. We proved that there's no biological difference between the races when we completed the Human Genome Project 16 years ago. And we should have known that long ago. So it's not race that's the problem, it's racism. The problem that's a lot older than America, and it's not just unique to our medical system. From housing, to jobs, to education, to getting a loan at the bank, Black Americans have historically been sent to the back of the bus and the bottom of the application pile. It still happens today. And we're often seen as less, even if we're ever seen at all. And that's because our institutions, our laws, our culture were built with a bias in our country against Black Americans. And this bias has been deadly. Black women who start prenatal care have higher rates in the first trimester, have higher rates of infant mortality than non-Hispanic white women with no prenatal care at all. Black mothers with college degrees have higher rates of harm than women of all races without high school diplomas. Black women who live in wealthy neighborhoods in the United States would have worse health outcomes than white, Hispanic, and Asian mothers in poor neighborhoods. These are the facts a lot of people don't know. They're facts a lot of us don't want to know, but we have to face up to them if we're going to turn them around. And that's where I have some hope. See, I'm not all bad news. The beauty here is that valuing people differently based on gender and race is a choice, and we can change our choices. We can choose to value everyone equally. We can counteract our own biases by trusting facts and numbers over faulty perceptions. My work at the National Birth Equity Collaborative and the Black Mamas Matter Alliance is all about finding solutions that work. We collaborate with hospitals and local communities to establish meaningful standards for respectful care, which can help ensure that Black women are being heard by providers. We invest in better research, offer training, and advocate for legislation to protect mothers' lives. And data collection is a huge part of these solutions because we don't value what we don't measure, and we don't measure what we don't see. This holds true around the world. I recently presented at the UN with the health minister of Uganda, a country that counts every maternal death. Why? Because the average mom in Uganda has 6 babies, so the death of one mother has huge ramifications for her family and her community. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we don't keep a precise record of maternal deaths. We estimate a range of 700 to 900 per year, as if the difference between those two numbers don't represent 200 shattered families. So part of my work is about the straightforward but critical task of counting and valuing women, specifically Black women. So we push for policy change by advocating for a metric score to keep track of Black women and how they are treated in the hospital. Were their voices listened to? Were their reports of pain taken seriously? We are collecting numbers for these problems so we can analyze them and address them. This kind of data collection is useful no matter where you are. It reduces the role of our biases play in preventing each person from receiving thorough, respectful care. And in the end, that's what we're all searching for, right? A system that treats everyone equally, where Black women, white women, and everyone else gets the same standard of care. People ask me all the time, well, why do you do this work? You're not really going to end racism, they tell me. But they misunderstand my goal. My goal is to make equality, real equality, so normal that you can not just feel it, you can measure it. And with enough honesty, training, and openness to change, I believe that's possible. Not only here in the United States, but in every country that we all call home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joya, for the important work that you're doing. Goalkeepers, perhaps you were surprised or even shocked to learn the extent of America's maternal mortality crisis. Anyone surprised? Yeah. This reality is especially discouraging because, as Dr. Joya notes, America spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world. But here's a story of hope. In 1994, genocide left more than 1 million dead in Rwanda. The health system was devastated. Yet between the years 2000 and 2013, Rwanda reduced maternal mortality by 77%. In fact, Rwanda was one of only 9 countries that achieved the Millennium Development Goal target on maternal mortality. Rwanda accomplished this in large part by dramatically increasing the number of skilled providers performing deliveries, and just as importantly, by training tens of thousands of community healthcare workers. These workers are administering what the World Health Organization refers to as culturally appropriate care. This is care that considers the individual needs, the cultural norms, and the context of patients. Rwanda is a reminder that change and success is possible where we might least expect it. Our next speaker is no stranger to change. Through a program called Beyond Bias, she has worked in different countries around the world to tackle some of our most entrenched biases, cultural ones. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Lydia Murithi.
I want you to picture a rural health clinic, say in my home country of Kenya. Now imagine a young girl, maybe 15 years in age, in the middle of a long queue outside the family planning room. She's surrounded by older women, most of them mothers. She's extremely nervous and looks out of place. When her turn comes, the provider tells her to go back to the end of the line and allow mothers to be served first. Those are more important, the provider says. By the time the young girl's time comes up again, clinic hours are over. Provider says, you could come back another day, remarking, after all, you should be focused on schoolwork, not boys. See, that young girl is not alone. Far from it. Today, 23 million adolescents in developing countries have an unmet need for contraception. And that is the problem. Not just because access to contraception should be a basic human right, but because depriving young people of it could lead to serious consequences. Unplanned pregnancies, unsafe birthing conditions, and undue hardship to women and their communities. And while we can and should be advocating for better policies and more resources, our providers' personal bias can thwart our best efforts. That's why my organization, Pathfinder International, in collaboration with our partners, WILUPS, Kembo Collective, and RAND, initiated the Beyond Bias project. We aim to understand what really goes wrong during those crucial moments of interaction between a patient and a provider, and what we can do about it. We work in Tanzania, Burkina Faso, and Pakistan. And in each country, we see similar stories. Some providers are morally opposed to offering contraception to an unmarried adolescent. Others don't provide contraception to any young person who has not yet had a child. Still others believe that withholding contraception is within the patient's best interests because they may think that it will decrease their likelihood of being sexually active and maybe contracting a sexually transmitted disease. So these biases are not new. In fact, many health workers go through trainings on providing better, more youth-friendly services. They make honest commitments to change. Yet, so often, the needs of young people still go unmet. You may ask why. It's because, as we've heard today, bias is a complex human condition, and it has so deep roots, extremely deep, to be addressed by training and supervision alone. That's why Beyond Bias takes a comprehensive behavior change strategy. We humanize bias. We build empathy, give social affirmation, and provide concrete support and social rewards that can change behavior. We begin by hosting a story-driven event, empathy-building event, where young people share firsthand with providers their experiences with denied care and the consequences they've suffered as a result. From there, we take providers through a journey of self-reflection, helping them develop self-awareness of their own biases. We give them a safe space where they can engage one another openly and without judgment, affirming that we all struggle with bias. Then we connect providers with each other so they can continue to build support networks. And finally, we implement a rigorous data analysis and reward progress through public certifications and letters of affirmation that could elevate a provider's practice. In short, Beyond Bias works with providers so that they can truly provide to every young person who seeks help in planning their future. See, to me, this work has been gratifying on a professional level and a personal one. See, I grew up in a community in Kenya where, women's sexual health and sexuality in general was a very hush-hush topic. I saw many women's lives devastated by a lack of access to care. I saw my own mother, though untrained, striving to provide care to women who had no other option and no access to care. So when I look at the young people we serve, I see myself. I know I could have been that girl. I could have been that young girl sent to the back of the queue at the health facility. And though our work is still in the early stages, what inspires me is that we've begun to see signs of positive change. And I firmly believe that we even can have more massive change. Just watch.
Elle est venue pour prendre une méthode contraceptive parce qu'elle a un petit copain. Elle m'a mis hors de moi-même, donc moi je l'ai tout de suite saché. Mais vu là, je me suis dit qu'à cet âge-là, elle ne devait pas avoir un petit copain. Mais 3 mois après, elle est revenue me voir parce qu'elle était enceinte. Je me suis culpabilisée. Elle est enceinte à cause de moi.
मेरी हर रोज़ अपने बाइक्स के साथ एक जंग है और मैं अपने क्लाइंट को ये कह देती थी कि मैं तुम्हें लॉन्ग टर्म मेथड नहीं दूंगी। तो ये सब करने से, क्योंकि मेरे अंदर ये बात थी कि कहीं ये गुनाह का काम है या इस पे जो है लोग मुझे क्या कहेंगे, मेरे बारे में किस तरह की राय कायम कर लेंगे।
Kulikuwa na story ambayo mimi ilinigusa sana ya binti mwenye miaka 18 ambaye kwa kukosa tu huduma ya uzazi wa mpango ilimpelekea kuwa na watoto wawili. Kwa hiyo hicho mimi kilinigusa sana na kikanifanya kwamba niweze kuona kwamba nina umuhimu wa kutoa huduma ya uzazi wa mpango kwa vijana bila kuwabagua.
Ce colloque a vraiment changé beaucoup de choses dans ma vie quotidienne. après avoir écouté les différents partages d'expériences personnelles, j'ai vu vraiment que j'ai vraiment changé.
As a healthcare provider, मेरे biases मेरे मिशन के रास्ते में एक बैरियर की तरह थे। मुझे अपने बायसेस को समझने के लिए अपने अंदर झांकने की ज़रूरत है, ताकि मैं ये समझ सकूं कि मेरे बायसेस का दूसरों की ज़िंदगी पर किस तरह से असर हो रहा है। ज़बरदस्त, इसके लिए तो फिर क्लैप होनी चाहिए भाई। ठीक है।
Please welcome to the stage Melinda Gates, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, Lydia Marithi, and Dr. Joya Creer-Perry.
You know, I think so often I'll say I come to talks like this or conferences like this, and we get very energized by what we hear on stage and hopefully inspired. But then we go home and we say, how am I going to put this into practice? And so as we thought about this panel, what we wanted to talk about a bit was what can you put into practice, or what's practical out in our own places, our communities? So I have some questions for all of them, and hopefully we'll have a conversation. Let's just start with you, Lydia. How have you thought about humanizing bias? I mean, we all know that it affects all of us, or we all have it. How do you think about the humanization piece of it?
Right, so the humanization piece, as you speak, comes from that recognition. It begins with the recognition that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so we inherently, like Jennifer said, if you have a brain, you have bias. And so that recognition borrows or brings to bear the need for us to have some level of empathy when we're engaging with one another. And that for us to be effective in the process of changing our personal bias and being cognizant of our personal bias, we have to be able to provide some level of a safe space and support for us to encourage introspection and self-reflection. Because the moment you shame people and condemn them, then they build a wall of defense. And so a quick example, like, work in Burkina Faso, when we, working with providers who, are trained on standards of care, but then still have, difficulties and express biases in serving young people. Instead of looking at them and saying, you should know better, our approach is let's have a conversation about, the fact that there could be times when you're conflicted, that your professional norms and your personal values at conflict, and how do you deal with that? And so we then bring ourselves to bear and create that ground of commonality where then we tell them about our own struggles, and then they open up to us. So it's that level of humility, intellectual humility, and empathy.
It's interesting, I got to visit last year the program, I didn't know about your program before in Burkina Faso, and I met with several of the women who were on screen, Flora in particular, and they were crying as they talked about the difference this training has made for them, because they said, we can think of specific girls that we turned away, and we wonder where they are now, and we think some of them are pregnant. And they know the difference it makes in their lives.
Absolutely.
Joya, you talk about data and what we measure, and I see the difference that data makes. It matters, right? And I've sat in meetings where we talk about, oh, there must not be that many adolescents in the world or in Africa who are having sex and who should have family planning. And now that we collect the data, it turns out there's almost 250,000 of them that want access to family planning. Talk about how, even for your own life, Joya, how has bias shown up for you as a Black woman in living in the U.S.?
So thank you so much. It's not lost on me that I sit here, as as I know of, a sixth-generation American, right, Black person in the United States, in this very privileged space to talk about health inequities in the U.S. context, and how, despite income and despite being here a long time, it shows up in how we receive care, how we even as providers are treated inside of the hospitals. And the importance of knowing that if we are the shining star that other countries are looking at, and yet we're treating people who are Black, who look like me, poorly, and it shows up in our access to me having a preterm birth, right? Like, in my training at a hospital that was named Confederate General just 20 years before I was training there. Those moments of understanding how racism and bias and not being counted and seen as fully human as a black person in America is important for us to share with others around the world. So, because we cannot be the example for others until we share the importance of not valuing people differently, and the hierarchy of human value based upon skin color is not how we're supposed to treat each other, right? So until we do that globally and be the example in the United States of what a true global community can look like, we're not going to be the shining star that we call ourselves to be.
And Jennifer, you are working in communities and in education systems now with police departments on bias. Share a little bit about that work with everybody in the room.
Yeah, so I think one of the big successes that came for me was working with the police department in Oakland, California. And so I, along with a couple of colleagues, went there and sort of worked with members of the department to try to help them to reduce the number of police stops that they were making of people who weren't committing any serious crimes. And so, how to do that, right? I think at the time, they felt that they needed to make that many stops because the crime rate would just kind of go through the roof if they didn't stop these people. But we sat down and we actually, when officers make a stop in Oakland, they're required to complete a form to say why they made the stop, the location of the stop, and so forth. And we just simply added a question to that form, which was, is this stop intelligence-led, yes or no? Right? And by intelligence-led, we mean, do you have credible information to tie this particular person to a crime? So now, each time an officer sees someone, when they're making the choice, should I stop this person, they have to ask that question. And we found in 2017, before we added that question to the form, they had about 32,000 stops around the city that year. And in 2018, with the addition of this simple checkbox, those stops went down to around 19,000. And if you looked at the stops of just African Americans alone, 43% reduction into the stops of African Americans.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're redesigning the system,
Yeah.
right? You're editing the code, and
Yeah.
you're getting that people to, police officers to just stop and pause for a minute with real information, much like the images you showed us there of the young Asian woman who, if you ask her about her gender, she does more poorly on the test. You ask her about, is she Asian, she does better, right? So it's that pause, right?
Yeah, it's a change in mindset with that pause.
With that, for that person, because we all have the bias.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the connection here that you see with the health system.
Yeah, for sure. So because of the advocacy we've been able to do with the Black Mamas Matter Alliance and our work, we've been able to work with the Centers for Disease Control, which in the United States is really our main organization that counts and measures, right? And so really working on what I spoke about earlier, how we're not counting Black women or women in general when it comes to maternal mortality. And we added in the data racism as a reason for the death. Now, what that makes people, that's a strategy, just like getting birth control is a strategy. The goal is justice. The strategy is adding this inside of the code, inside of the platform or the technology. What that makes the committees have to stop and do is understand what racism even means, to have a conversation about what we would then do differently. Do we mean interpersonal racism? Do we mean structural racism? But at least adding that one moment in time, just like adding the question for the policeman, makes people have to stop and think. And then work through their own biases to come up with a solution that's best for everyone. So that requires advocacy, organizing, working with your structures that are in place, and we do that around the world, and hopefully we continue to do that work.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to say too, in Oakland, it wasn't just the change in the mindset of the officers on the street, but there was a change in the mindset of the leadership.
Yes.
They started to ask themselves, well, why did we think, that we needed to stop that many people, right?
Crime was going to go up, and it didn't, right?
And crime actually continued to fall, as they were stopping way fewer people, and so it forced them to adjust their thinking around it. And for the first time, they started having these conversations about bias. And and how does bias influence, could bias be influencing the decisions we make in policing?
I love that how you're getting people to pause and then you're actually using a mindset and some data and you're doing it in this way with the police force, but then it's trickling up to leadership. But it's also why leadership matters, right? That what we see is, you say, in terms of role modeling, we look out and we say, can that person be a leader? We have to change our leaders at the top too, so they think differently top down. You're also, in the humanizing that you do, Lydia, and your organization, you're also getting people to pause and get this mindset change. How did you start to say to yourself, I want to do this not just in Kenya, but what got you to open your mind and say, I'm going to do it not just in my country, but I'm going to do it in Burkina Faso and other places?
Well, yeah, so the intention of the Beyond Bias project and this initiative was actually to tackle this issue of bias, because bias is not a new thing. You know, for a number of decades, about 5 decades actually, we've been training providers. And so one thing we've learned is that training is not getting us to where we ought to be. The training is helpful and supervision is helpful, but then it's not getting us beyond where we need to be. So we launched this, this project to look at, you know, globally, because we are in Tanzania to be able to inform East Africa, West Africa, Burkina Faso, and in Pakistan for South Asia. And we're looking for really new ideas, and we're coming up with creativity, you know, using the human-centered design with our partner YLabs, on how we can really, you know, cut this code of bias and what we can really talk to providers that is different and that is new. And what we've learned is that providers actually don't know what they're supposed to do. And there's such a desirability bias nowadays that you find that when you do a survey, a regular survey, as we've always done, providers will tell you exactly what you want to hear. And so they'll check the boxes, they'll tell you what you want to hear. But when the young person gets through the door, those 5 minutes of critical interaction, then the provider goes back to their own values. And instead of espousing or upholding the standards of care, they go back to their own personal values. That's why we learned that we have to help them, you know, dig deeper and deal with their, you know, deeper issues of, you know, the conflict that they have within and the conflict of their personal values versus their professional values to really be able to address the issue.
When we were backstage, or just having known some of you over time, I know you've all faced bias in your own lives. And this is a heavy topic that we're discussing, but you're giving us a lot of reasons to think through it and how to think through it. Tell me, in the midst of some difficult work, what keeps each of you hopeful? You want to start, Joya?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So places like this keep me hopeful for sure. Having a global community that's connected, that understands the importance of working on bias and how we're all connected to each other, and that you don't have to have experienced it personally to have empathy for something, right? You could believe, you could have access and resource and still believe everyone has equal value and should have all the things that they're supposed to have to live. So that conversation of us being a global community is really important. So this keeps me hopeful, so thank you.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think for me, so we're all vulnerable to bias, but we don't act on that bias all the time. You know, so you know, bias is something that can be triggered by the situations that we find ourselves in, and that makes me hopeful, right? Because the situations can change. That we have control, you know, over those situations. We have control over whether we're going to stop and slow down, whether we're going to reflect. You know, so those kinds of things. And I think also just meeting people who, you know, who've struggled, they're struggling, they're fighting, and you know, through the pain, you know, they're still able to kind of come to the table and try to figure out how to, you know, make a better way, and not just for themselves, but for the people around them, and that's really, really inspiring to me.
For me, what keeps me going is the resilience of the people we serve. You know, I like to keep my mind with that girl in the village. And I feel like if that girl in the village, with all the odds that she has to face, still has hope, then I too can be hopeful. I too can be hopeful.
Yes, beautiful.
Right.
Just in closing, I would like to say, I think, we've heard a lot today about that hopefully is opening our own minds to bias and how we might redesign it in ourselves and in our communities. I heard many of you speak about turning inwards. And first turning inwards and seeing where we have own bias in our lives. I did a little reflection yesterday at the end of a very busy day and realized a place yesterday for me, it came up backstage where I had bias about somebody who was going on to stage. And where it came up in a meeting that I sat in where there was clearly bias towards me in terms of the topics that came up. And this is why we need leaders of all different types, and we need different types of advocates creating and designing new systems, talking about data in new ways, opening ways for these conversations. So please join me in thanking these 3 incredible women leaders. Thank you.
A few years ago, in the lead up to my wedding, I received a lot of advice about how to be a good Christian wife. I was told the burden of work in the home, the cooking, the cleaning was mine to bear, and that if my husband decided to help, he was doing me a favor. I was told my most urgent task was to become a mother, and that any personal or professional dreams I had needed to be shelved until I raised children. I was told to subsume my identity into my husband's, and to make my primary purpose actualizing his. When I decided to do womanhood my own way, I was told I was defying the Bible's instructions to submit. And when I began to write and blog about the intersection of gender equality and Christianity, I was called everything from weird to rebellious. But here's the thing about the Bible. Whatever you go to it looking for, you will find. If you go to the Bible looking for verses to justify oppressing women, yes, you will find them. And if you go to the Bible looking for verses that support the liberation and honor of women, believe me, you will find them too. You see, having worked and engaged with feminist theologians across different faiths, what I've come to realize about people of faith is this: we all pick and choose. We are all selectivists. No human being approaches a religious text with a clean slate. We come with our own histories, our cultures, our identities, our motives, and more. We interpret scripture through our experiences and our biases. Now, I know that talking about religion in spaces like this one isn't always deemed polite. But as changemakers and goalkeepers, religion is an influencer we cannot afford to ignore. Religion doesn't just show up in our homes and our places of worship. It shows up in our schools, our communities, and our governments. In Nigeria, I've seen legislators of all faiths refuse to pass a gender and equal opportunities bill that would give women basic human rights on the grounds of religion. You see, religion can be a powerful force for good, but it can also be a tool to reinforce inequality. Religion is complex, and yes, it can often seem contradictory. But I always come back to one simple teaching from my own faith. It's one that can connect all of us: Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, and many others. Love your neighbor as yourself. You see, love is my religion. In her book, Moment of Lift, Melinda Gates writes, "The supreme goal for humanity is not equality, it is connection. Equality without connection misses the point. When people are connected, they feel woven into each other. You are a part of me, and I am a part of you. If either of us suffers, we suffer together." This blurs the borders between human beings, and what flows through those porous borders is love. Love is what makes us one. Love is what lifts us up. That, to me, is a guiding light for all of us. Not just in this session, but in our work. Let love be our bias. While we'll often stray from that goal, and while the limitations and the imperfections of our humanity might at times slow our progress, it is in fact that same humanity that can unite us and motivate us towards something better. If you take away anything from today's session, I hope it is this: bias is a part of who we are. It can have real consequences. But overcoming bias is not impossible. We can choose to reframe our view. We can choose to see human beings and to hear them. We can choose to be biased toward love and to use love as a fuel to drive positive change. And what gives me hope is that so many of you in this room already do. Thank you.